So, hello, greetings. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here, and today is the 18th of October 2019. So, I'm recording this talk in a series on really aimed at Christian clergy and Christian priests, monks, nuns, the faithful, all the Christians out there. I'm talking specifically, it's like a training course on what should Christians be doing about Brexit. Does it matter? Is it a theological issue? Should we be concerned for Brexit? Should we take sides? I mean, if you're the vicar of a busy parish, somewhere, anywhere in Britain, from any denomination of Christianity, or if you're a kind of cyber Christian, or you're a New Age Christian, or a Gnostic Christian, or whatever, you might be a socialist Christian socialist, you might be, a Conservative Party member or a Liberal Party member or any kind of thing. There are Christians all over Britain, obviously, and obviously all over Europe, and also in the British citizens who are here in Europe. I'm speaking from the heart of France. Sometimes I feel a bit like Thomas à Becket, who took exile in France as well. My name is Thomas, of course. So anyway, greetings. I'm speaking as a lay Anglican and a Quaker attender, a universal Druid Christian, a member of the Universal Church, if you want. I regard myself as both Catholic in the sense of universalist, but also Protestant in that I will protest against injustice wherever I see it. And Gnostic in that I believe, like Clement of Alexandria, that all Christians have a duty to find wisdom. I believe Christ was a teacher of gnosis and enlightenment, lysis, to use the Pythagorean term, or what's the point of his teachings? He was a great rabbi. I'm also a Christian Kabbalist. I've studied the Kabbalah, which is behind me, and I talked about Moses to Leon in my last Sunday's address. So if you're not familiar with the Kabbalah, you can look at that. But I'm also a Sufi. I appreciate the Islamic understanding of Christ. Muhammad believed Christ was the Messiah. I mean, he believed Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. He accepted that. He just had a different interpretation of the theology behind the Trinity, which many Christians did, many Gnostics did, particularly Arius and others. And he also said, look, let's not let that theological stuff get in the way of what we have to do, which is build a peaceful world, look after the orphans, the widows, and generally get on with each other. Islam was a kind of reform at Christianity, if you want, in some respects, but big enough to embrace Judaism. So that was his attempt. I'm also an academic expert in religious studies, and as you know, I've published this periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies, and in my career as a secondary school teacher of religious studies, which I've loved for many years, the different colours represent different religions. Christianity is all the blue boxes, and there are many, many varieties, as you can see. I mean, you can look at this; it's online, or you can buy the book, or you can email me if you've got questions about it. So it was designed as a teaching tool for use in universities, schools, seminaries, and so on, around the world in every faith. And yes, Reverend Peter Owen Jones, who did that marvellous TV series Around the World in 80 Faiths, he should have had a copy of this. It would have been his guidebook. Okay, so today is St. Luke's Day, and I've taken an oath to do a teaching on each of the major saints' day behind the Gospels. Today is the next one in the sequence. It's St. Luke's Day. And I'm therefore going to be looking at Brexit through the lens of St. Luke, addressed to Christians, particularly to Christian intellectuals, thinkers, people of spirit, people of authority within the church. I'd love every single bishop in Britain to listen to this talk, every single pastor and minister in the church, whether you're Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, Anglican, whatever shade, it doesn't matter. To me, there's one universal church, and that's what we should all belong to, which is the church of those called to bear witness to the light, which is what I try to do in my own small way as a teacher. So Luke is amazing. The timing of this talk is very interesting. It's the 18th of October, and tomorrow is going to be Saturday the 19th, when there's a huge march in London. I'm hoping I might be able to get there at the last minute, a miracle, or certainly I hope many of my friends will be there. My institute hopefully is having a meeting at St James's Church in Piccadilly. I used to know the vicar there, who was a good friend of mine, and we're meeting in the Peace Garden, where there's a statue of peace, and then going on the march. So good luck to everyone that makes it, and yes, to all the 1 million plus people that will be on that march, sincere best wishes. At the last march, I wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury and said, look, why don't you lead a team up from Canterbury to lead this march spiritually? In the days of the great CND marches in London, there was always a Christian CND presence. Where's Christian Brexit? I've set up a little Facebook group, ecumenical Christians against Brexit, and I don't understand why the churches are not more vociferous in their appeal against Brexit. And I think it's it's a matter of some complexity, which I will be addressing during the course of this talk. I think one of the reasons is that British people on the whole, English people perhaps in particular, like to pride themselves on being law-abiding. We know, after having experienced the bitterness of a civil war back in the 17th century and other kind of attempted civil wars and 2 world wars and so on, that actually getting on with each other and being peaceable is probably one of the highest of all Christian duties. So we tend not to shout too much. It's not the done thing in English society to jump up and down and blow the whistle too much. And so the view has taken hold, I think, in Britain that, oh well, Brexit, yes, it's a catastrophe, but what can we do? It was the vote of the majority. That's what the political parties have all said. We just have to go along with it and not cause too much trouble and keep our heads down. It's that sort of not protesting kind of mentality that has, I would say, replaced actual authentic Christianity. To put my Kierkegaard hat on a minute, that's pseudo-Christianity, that sort of not speaking the truth in case it hurts people type attitude. And it becomes a politics of silencing. I think the Queen and her court are extremely well practiced in this. The Queen never comments on anything. That is taking this silencing to its quintessential pinnacle of performance. Actually, I'm sure if you talk to the Queen privately, it's a whole different picture. And I have colleagues and friends who've spoken to the Queen personally, and she's actually much more tolerant, broad-minded, and intellectually acute than her public persona allows her to be. I think that's a sad reflection on our society, that we expect and demand our Queen or our King to be ignorant. In the technical sense of the term of ignoring, they're supposed to ignore. So I don't think they should. I think the Queen, the monarch, the head of state, is a defender of the realm, a defender of the faith, and a defender of the morality that is at the basis of our society. If a society ceases to be based on morality, it ceases to be, because everything comes from morality, everything comes from Dharma. That's what Buddhists tell us, that's what Hindus tell us, that's what Druids tell us. A Druid is simply someone that can see that Dharma, etymologically and factually. So if instead a society becomes based on silence, a conspiracy of co-silencing, then it becomes an oppressive and a self-destructive society. And it becomes like the boy on the Titanic who can't get the message up in time to the bridge that the thing's about to hit the iceberg. So no evasive action is taken, it just goes into the iceberg. I'm like that boy. I feel like that boy who spotted the iceberg coming up. There's a few seconds to move the ship out of harm's way, otherwise it's going down. It's as simple as that. And yet nobody on the bridge is listening. Nobody seems to care. Because we have this culture of silencing. If you hear, then you have responsibility. If you listen, you have responsibility. And so people choose to block their ears, not listen. And say, oh, these are just Remainers, extreme eccentrics, extremists. So the myth has got out there in British society that the best thing to do to be moderate, because everybody wants to be moderate and stick to the middle way. We've all read our Aristotle, we've all done ethics. So we say, well, there are extreme Brexiteers who want to crash out with a hard deal. There are extreme Remainers who want a second referendum. So the middle thing is, let's have a deal and go out with that. Moderate, decent, good people will do that. That's what the Tory party position is, because they appeal to that, culture of silencing and moderation. However, and so I think a lot of Christians have fallen into that camp. They think, no, got to get it done, moderate, we're just like decent people, Well, the attractiveness of that position is such that it appeals to certain types of Christians who keep their head down, who don't protest, who don't want to be arrested for, civil disobedience or anything. That's an extremist action. However, I think this whole thing is a distortion. And it's premised on a sort of false reading of history and a false narrative right from day one. It's premised on a series of lies, because silencing creates a culture in which lies can take hold. Now, and I think our duty as Christians is to bear witness to truth. It's not to bear witness to pacification or silencing or the suppression of truth. There comes a point where the Christian actually has to bear witness to light, okay, in the context of their times, and it's always different. Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany had to bear witness in his way. The saints of history, if you read their stories, had to bear witness each in their own way. And the same with the writers of the Gospels, Luke, who we celebrate today, who was a major saint. So anyway, I'll come back to the question of timing and Brexit strategy right at the end, because I want to focus on theology for a time now. My reading of the Bible is it's not a book about silencing. It's a book contra silentium. It's about speaking out, speaking up, and bearing witness. That was Kierkegaard's point, that if you're the kind of Christian that just wants an easy life, well, you shouldn't be a Christian. It's the wrong path. This is a path that is about bringing enlightenment from the cave of Panyas down into the streets of busy, war-torn, conflict-ridden Jerusalem. If you want to stay up in the cave and chill out, meditate 24/7 and just do nothing about the world and just, hum om, then that's not the Christian path. Christ was about bringing the wisdom of the Himalayas into the busyness of the city streets of Nottingham or Birmingham or Manchester or Glasgow or London. It's not an easy path, but it had to be done, it has to be done, and that's why I'm bothering to record this teaching, because as you know, busy vicars in parishes throughout the country, ordinary people matter. That's what is the lifeblood of the church. People with lives, with difficulties, with marriages, with children, with schools, with unemployment or jobs or whatever. How do we get on as a society? If we don't speak out, the country is going to break up. It's as simple as that. Now, a certain type of person will say, oh, well, don't mention that because, gosh, God forbid, that might give the Scots ideas. They might go for independence. My dear friends, sorry, it's out of the bottle. The genie's out of the bottle. Nicola Sturgeon said in a speech earlier this week, we are going for an independence vote in 2020. Now, that is irregardless of what happens over Brexit. Scotland will get that vote. They're very clever politically. They kind of invented the rules of the modern British state. They're going to be very skillful about disentangling from it. They will get their second referendum, and I believe, having lived in Scotland and having many dear Scottish friends and knowing the mood of the Scottish people, there's no way they will now vote for Remain in the UK, because the Scots are feeling utterly betrayed by the UK establishment. It was promised to them that if they voted to stay in the UK when they had their referendum on that topic, that then they would be able to stay in the EU. That was one of the big attractions. They were told that if you vote to leave the UK, you'll be out of the EU. You'll be just a little dark, dank kingdom north of Hadrian's Wall, and you'll be out of the EU and out of the UK, and furthermore, the rest of the UK would never let you back in. Now, that was the threat that the London media, the BBC, the Tory party, the mainstream politicians, right of centre and centre-right, all hurled at the Scots. And it worked. A lot of them said, my God, we don't want to go out into utter darkness, we better vote for the UK then. And I took part in that referendum, and I did vote for keeping the UK together, and that was one of the reasons why. I had this fear that Scotland would become, a little separate country, and its economy would crash, and it would end up like another Greece. I mean, that was the fear that was touted at people. Now, the whole thing was propaganda and lies, because here we are a few years later, as Nicola Sturgeon pointed out, and the whole situation is reversed. Scotland is now being dragged out of the European Union, which is the thing it wanted to stay in and why it voted to remain in the UK, because of this referendum in 2016, where largely the English voters, for all kinds of complex propagandistic and brainwashing and miseducation reasons, and some no doubt genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. I have many friends that voted for Brexit thinking they were doing the right thing. I think most of them have realised that it was a mistake, and over 2 million people have apparently changed their mind now. I think probably actually more have. And so now the Scots are being told, well, tough, you're going to leave the EU. Well, I'm sorry, that is not acceptable in any system of fair play in politics. In real politics, Carl Schmitt, Adolf Hitler, Franco type school, that's fine, tough, you're leaving the EU. The Scots aren't, thank God, sunk to that level of barbarism. They're an intelligent nation who had an enlightenment. They had an amazing clutch of great thinkers, intellectuals. They had a school system, thanks to the Scottish Reformation, which brought literacy into every Scottish home. They value learning, they value teachers, they value education still, incredibly. And they have some of the greatest universities in the world. I used to be an enthralled user of Glasgow University Library for 5 years and wrote many of my books and stuff, particularly using the fantastic facilities of the theology faculty library. So no, the Scots are very intelligent people. They're not going to accept this this distortion, which is premised on nobody having a memory. The way that the media is manipulated by elite billionaires who run it is premised on cultural amnesia. Nobody can remember what happened last year. Well, I'm a historian. I remember very, very well what happened during the Scottish referendum, and although I voted to keep the UK together, I'm utterly appalled at the callous, cruel and immoral way that the English politicians and MPs have been baying for this hard Brexit against the will and wishes of the Scottish people ever since. Starting with Theresa May, now Boris Johnson. I've been in personal correspondence with the UK state over this, expressing my complete and utter abhorrence of this, and partly this is on Christian grounds, because surely the British state is supposed to be governed by morality and Christianity. It's still the religion of our monarch. It's the religion that Parliament wakes up to every day and has prayers before it starts its business. The God that I read about in the Bible, the God that I read about in St. Luke, is not a God of indifference, not a God of silencing, not a God of hushing up uncomfortable truths, and is a God of love, a God of care and compassion. And so when the UK is in danger of breaking up, that God insists that his scribes and scholars like me speak out. And were St. Luke alive today, he would be on that march tomorrow, as would all the great saints, I believe. So anyway, let's carry on. Let's do a bit of our studies. So let's do a bit of theological work here. Firstly, the context. It's interesting. Who is Luke? Why is he writing this at this time? He's a learned man. He probably starts as a Greek pagan. He's a Hellenistic universalist. He would have read philosophy and stuff. He's a learned man because he was a medical doctor. So he has at least a medical degree, which means he will have studied philosophy and rhetoric, and he'll be learned and literate. He comes from Antioch, which was a very civilized city in what is now Syria. And he was an extremely, acute observer of human nature, because you have to be if you're a doctor. It takes all types of people, but you have to be compassionate to all. He's very interested in Christ's healing mission. That's one of the things that I think drew him into early Christian circles. He would be interested in what we would now call spiritual healing, and I'm sure that he was very interested in that. So he gives early on in the gospel. He later becomes a friend and disciple of St. Paul. One question that theologians are asking is, did Luke ever meet Christ? As a young man, he may well have been in a group of people witnessing some of the sermons at a distance, some of the bigger events. He might have even been one of the 70 who were like in the larger group. Christ had 12 inner disciples, and he had a close coterie of inner people that he worked with: Mary Magdalene, her entourage, Susanna, and others. There was that group, and then there was a wider group, 70, who were friends of friends, and Luke might have been one of that group. I suspect he had met Christ, but not as an innermost disciple. But certainly he later meets Paul and works with him, and he then accompanies Paul on some of his journeys, and he ends up with him being shipwrecked and ending up on the island of Malta, which is recorded at the very end of Acts, which is the second book he writes. And it's a fascinating little snippet of history that he ends up going to Malta, which is a wonderful little island country in the middle of the Mediterranean, which is part of the Commonwealth and also part of the European Union. I think Maltese people, I know them, are deeply upset at the idea of Brexit, because they want the best of both worlds, like Britain has. They want Commonwealth status, they want to be part of the European Union. It seems the best of both worlds. Why on earth is Britain throwing this away? Well, thank you to my friends in Malta, I couldn't agree more. It's also an island dedicated to the goddess. It's one of the oldest Neolithic sanctuaries, temple complexes in the world, and the goddess of wisdom, the goddess of peace, I think hovers over the New Testament and over Christ's teachings. It's there symbolically in the form of the Holy Spirit, which descends at his baptism. But it's there in the Shekinah of the Christian Kabbalah that inspires Christ as a teacher. Christ was a rabbi of wisdom. And wisdom is the feminine aspect of the divine nature, which also inspires Enoch and all the great prophetic ministrations of both Christianity and Islam and Judaism. It's that hidden facet of wisdom that is what demarcated Solomon. Christ was a descendant of Solomon, okay, if you look at Matthew and the other genealogies. All the genealogies agree on just one thing: he's descended from Solomon, right? That's a giveaway. What they're saying is Christ is a wisdom teacher. And as such, therefore, it was totally appropriate that his eldest disciple, although he only met him out of body, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing about Paul. He had a transpersonal experience, but it was convincing enough. It's like the French Gnostic bishop Jules Douanel, who had an out-of-body mystical encounter with an old Cathar bishop who had been bishop of Montségur, and that led him to refound the Gnostic Church in the 1890s, along with Lady Caithness. So Paul had a similar kind of revelation. And Luke was there with him. That's what I love in Malta. They end up going to Rome, and then Paul is then, for judgment. And then it stops. Acts stops there. Now why? Where's the rest of the story? We want to know what happened next, Well, the supposition is, and it's put forward in a very good historical novel called The Flames of Rome, which I strongly recommend people to read, by a classical scholar, whose name escapes me, but you can Google it. which he argues that the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts were drawn up in order to provide defence at Paul's trial, the first trial in Jerusalem. He'd been sent there from Caesarea for causing trouble. Lots of adventures. He finally makes it to Rome and he's tried. And then Luke was asked by someone that was an official in the Roman authorities in Rome, but not a Christian, but sort of a neutral good pagan, if you want, called Theophilus. And the Flames of Rome speculates as to who that was. Possibly it was like the head prefect of Rome. And then the books are drawn up in defence of Paul. The theory is that Paul was then acquitted that first trial. But then at the second trial, he was then sentenced to death. Now that was under Nero. And Nero was a very, very unpleasant piece of work, a seriously evil man. And seriously disturbed. I mean, nowadays we would have locked someone like that up in a mental hospital and done some serious healing work on him. The circumstances of how Nero got to have that power over Paul and kill him. Oh, the theory, by the way, is that Luke escaped right at the end of the Flames of Rome, which I strongly urge people to read. Paul and Peter are knowing they're going to be killed. They send off Luke to escape with his 2 books, saying, you must get out and tell this story to the world, We won't survive this. So the theory is that Nero really hated anyone that opposed his absolute authority and power. He stands for that kind of cruel misapplication of power. You see, political power should always be applied like medical power. A surgeon has tremendous skill and knowledge, and you can cut people up and you can give poisons, but a good doctor swears the Hippocratic Oath always to do the right thing, to save life. Politicians, in my view, should be required to swear an equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, to tell the truth, to do their best as they see it for society, not for their self-advancement, but for the policies that govern the body politic. That's what makes a statesperson, not a politician on the make. The fundamental thing is the question of truth, and that's why I've campaigned for a duty of veracity to be accepted in law in the UK Parliament and then other parliaments. But anyway, Nero's story is very sad, and in a nutshell it's this, that Claudius was emperor, and Claudius was an intellectual, actually. His first wife was Etruscan. He was a lover of the Etruscan culture and languages. He's beautifully written about in Robert Graves' wonderful book, I, Claudius. He was fascinated by Druids. He wanted to know about the mysteries. He appreciated Numa Pompilius, all the old stories of Rome. To talk with Claudius would have been an intellectual treat. What his mistake was he was useless at choosing women. Totally. His first Etruscan wife, it didn't work out. Then he married again, Messalina, and that was an absolute catastrophe because she turned out to be a sort of nymphette on steroids. She was an absolute sex maniac who just kept having affairs behind his back. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Eros, it's a great thing, but the way she was doing it was foul and evil. She then went too far. She got married to a chap who was one of Claudius's, staff, behind his back, had a public ceremony and a party and an orgy in Rome when Claudius was at the seaside. Unbelievable. Poor old Claudius found out. I mean, he really loved his wife, right? Messalina. And they had a son who he doted on, who was going to become the next emperor. During this time, Claudius thought, well, he better invade Britain. Well, that was a mistake. I think Claudius should have sent a mission to study the Druid teachings and establish a treaty of friendship. Claudius was a fool. I dare say Messalina put him up to it. I don't know the whole, Robert Graves did well, but he didn't do the full definitive study of Claudius. We need still, a second edition of Graves' work with much more detail. He never mentions his Etruscan interests, for instance, which is a ridiculous lacuna. So instead, Messalina persuades him, and she has this son with him. And Claudius goes off and invades Britain, and of course, because the Roman Empire is such a powerful military force, it conquers in 43 AD. And he then goes to Colchester and has a triumph and parades around the streets saying, look, I've conquered Britain. I mean, of course he hadn't conquered Britain, he hadn't conquered Scotland, Wales, Ireland, large parts of even, the uplands of Western Britain. But it was enough for the sort of the PR performance. He then goes back, and then his wife Messalina betrays him, and he has a nervous breakdown, effectively. He has her killed, and the son of their marriage, who he had earlier called Britannicus in honour of the conquest of Britain, he was quite humble, Claudius. He said, when the Senate said, we want to call you Britannicus, he said, oh, no, it's not for me, but I'll give it to my son. So his dear son, when Messalina had been called Britannicus, but now, because Messalina had betrayed him, he disinherited him from taking over the empire. And instead he'd remarried a woman called Agrippina. The trouble was, she was worse than Messalina. So we have a succession of moral failures going on here. And Agrippina was a scheming woman who she wanted to promote her son, who was Nero. And ultimately, to cut a very long story short, you can read it in I Claudius, she eventually kills off Claudius to ensure that Nero succeeds sooner rather than later. Golly gosh. So this is the moral health of the nation at the time when Paul is going around preaching universal truth, love and light, and when Luke is trotting along as his secretary, writing up the notes, writing the text that is going to become his book, the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of and the Book of Acts. Rome is in moral meltdown, and Nero is promoted by his mother, who's just murdered Claudius, and he becomes emperor. And then the horrendous power games that go on in Nero's early reign, eventually he kills his own mother, because it seems in Rome in those days the only way you could get any power was to kill people. Well, that's what we're up against, and that's the kind of depth of moral evil that Rome had sunk to. Now, against that came this amazing light from the Orient, came these simple people, but among them was Luke, who was, as I say, a medical doctor and an intellectual, and who brought this text to Rome, which laid out the whole story for the average intellectual or educated Roman to read it. Now, so far as I know, Nero never read any Christian scriptures or anything. He just took an instinctive dislike and hatred to this notion of Christians, because as he understood it, what they were saying was that there was a higher power than him, the emperor, and that the emperor's will was not sovereign in all things, and that the emperor himself, or any emperor or king or whatever in history, was themselves under judgment. There was a higher God who would in turn judge all the emperors of the world, and that Jesus Christ had been his servant and representative and manifestation, even as it were his son. Well, this was like a wake-up call to an evil